So here we are with Chapter 1 of the Anatomy and Physiology class, and we are going to begin with an introduction and discuss the organization of the bodies of living organisms and the requirements and the characteristics that we associate with living organisms in this first lecture. So let's dive in. So we'll start by thinking about what are the differences between anatomy, that term, and what the study of anatomy is, and the study of physiology. So anatomy is the study of the structure of the body. So all of the parts of the body, where they're located, what their shapes are, their colors, descriptions of the parts, how they are found in relationship to each other. These are all things that we associate with the study of anatomy. And, you know, one of the ways that I really like to try to pick apart what is happening in anatomy and physiology is by thinking about what are the derivations of the roots, the words that are associated with anatomy and physiology. So looking back, what is the Greek root for a word or the Latin root for a word? And in the case of anatomy, we can break it apart very easily. Ana means apart or away from each other. Tome is about cutting. So the literal definition of anatomy is cutting apart the body. And so it's a chance to look inside and see what the structures are and where they're found. Physiology takes that one step further by thinking not just about what the structures are like, but what their functions are, how they do the work that they do. And the derivation of that, physis, physis, is nature. Ology, anytime you see an LOGY ending, then you know you're dealing with the study of a particular topic or subject. So, anatomy and physiology. One is about the parts, and the other is about how those parts do their work. So, when we think about anatomy, there are two levels or two broad classifications of anatomy that we can consider. One of them is gross anatomy, and no, that doesn't mean, ooh, it's icky and bloody and gooky and snotty or whatever. It's not gross as in unappealing. Instead, gross is, the Latin root gro means large or big. And so gross anatomy is about understanding the structures or seeing, the study of the structures that are macroscopic. Macro means large, so as opposed to microscopic, which means very small. So with gross anatomy, we're looking at structures that don't require any magnification to be able to see them, where microscopic anatomy is the study of those structures that are smaller than what the unaided human eye can look at, and so a microscope is required. So gross anatomy might look at the heart, where microscopic anatomy would look at the cardiac muscle cells that compose the heart. So when you're trying to understand anatomy, there are several skills that are going to be very important to master. The first is observation. And so that means that in your reading, as you look at diagrams or pictures, as you are working with a model or with structures from a formerly living organism, as you look at your own body or the body of your partner or your children or your classmates, you need to become good at observing and noticing these parts. You'll have the opportunity to use models and preserve specimens in order to look at, see from all angles these anatomical parts. And then finally, there is a huge amount of terminology associated with anatomy. And it can be almost like learning a foreign language. So if you've taken Spanish in high school or here at the college, then you have some sense of the kind of practice that it requires to learn the language of anatomy. And so note cards, flashcards can be very useful. And regular repetition, constant and consistent practice is what it takes to really master these terms and understanding, and remembering them. Okay, so the other half of the class is about physiology. And when we think about physiology, we can be looking at specific organ systems. So, for instance, pulmonary physiology. When you see that pulm, then you know that we're talking about the lungs and the blood supply to the lungs. Neurophysiology. What would you suspect that neurophysiology is about? Hopefully you came to nervous system. So neurophysiology would look at the function of the neurons, the primary cells that are responsible for conveying information throughout the body. So we can look at specific organs and organ systems, or we may dive even deeper, and this would be sort of the analog to microscopic anatomy. We can look at how physiology is working at the molecular and cellular levels of complexity in the body. So, for instance, muscle contraction is going to require the understanding of how huge numbers of ions move both into and out of an individual muscle cell, creating the stimulus or the signal for that muscle cell to contract, to shorten. And if enough muscle cells contract and shorten, then the entire muscle will also contract and shorten. Or, for instance, with urine production, we have to look very closely at the cells that are that form the nephron tubules. These are very small tubules that make up a large proportion of the kidney tissue, and it's their job to selectively keep things that we want to have remain in the body, and selectively excrete from the body all the waste materials or the excess materials that we want to get rid of, that we don't want to keep in the body. So this idea of physiology can, we're going to be looking at the very smallest of structures in the body as we discuss physiology in this class. So if you look on page 12 of the book, you'll see this illustration, and this is trying to get across to you the levels, the array of levels of organizations that we can associate within the human body. So we work our way to less and less and less complex by starting first with the organism. So a human is composed of a large number of organ systems that all work interdependently to maintain living body. Those organ systems, so for instance we're seeing the digestive system here, are composed of a variety of organs that all work together to do a specific function, in this case digesting and absorbing all the nutrients that we consume. Organs are composed of tissues. Tissues are clusters of cells that all have similar anatomy and similar function. So they're all working together to perform a function. In the case of, say, the tissues that line the stomach, it's to produce the enzymes and the acids that are used to begin digestion of the food that we consume. Tissues are composed of individual cells, and the cell is the very smallest living component of the body. So as we think about levels of organization, cells and larger, this is all the living components, while the components of cells are made up of a variety of organelles. These organelles would all be considered non-living. So anything that is lower in these levels of organization than the cell is a non-living component of the body. So organelles, for instance, if you remove them from the cell, will not survive long. They will disintegrate fairly rapidly when removed from a cell. Organelles are composed of macromolecules. Macromolecules are large clusters of smaller, usually repeated subunits of molecules. Molecules are clusters of atoms, and for it to truly be called a molecule, it has to be multiple kinds of atoms. So multiple elements have to be comprising the molecule. And then finally, we get down to the lowest level of complexity, the atom. Now that's as far as we're going to go in this course, but of course the atom is not the end of the story, and we've got to work our way into ever smaller things, and that's kind of the realm of chemistry and physics, mostly physics at that point. And if we wanted to, we could think about clusters of humans living together, functioning together. Now we're entering the realm of sociology or ecology, especially as we think about humans and how they interact with the living and non-living components of their environment. So study can proceed on into larger levels of organization as well. So we're going to restrict the work that we do in this class to this zone. These components are discussed a lot in Chapter 2. This is a chapter that we're not going to study. Then we get to these components in Chapter 3. This is Chapter 4. And then we're going to start looking at organ and organ systems as we move on into further chapters. So that's kind of giving an overview of both how the body is organized and how the course is organized as well. So if we look at these levels of organization, and I'm going to use this slide to lecture from, but you'll notice that there are 2 more slides that have a fair bit of information. I'm going to skip over these fairly rapidly. So now I'm going back to the one that I'm going to lecture from, but know that you've got some more information coming. So if the atom is the lowest level that we're going to be looking at, well, atoms are composed of 3 types of subatomic particles. There are electrons. These are the components of an atom that have a negative charge. There are protons. These are the components that have a positive charge. And then there are neutrons. Neutrons have no charge at all. And even though we're not going to be studying much about these smaller components that make up atoms, I wanted to bring this up because we are going to be looking at ions. Ions are atoms that have either lost or gained electrons. So for instance, a hydrogen ion is composed of a proton and a single neutron, and that's it. Because if it were not ionic, then it would have a little electron associated with it, but because it's lost its electron, rather than having a neutral charge, it has an overall positive charge. So there's a lot more about this in Chapter 3. I'm really going to rely on your high school chemistry, so that would have been physical science, where you would have had some exposure to chemistry to help you understand what we're talking about here. And as well, you're always welcome to meet me during office hours or make an appointment with me at some other time to talk about this topic or other things. So a hydrogen ion is a proton and a neutron, no electron, so it has a positive charge. Chloride ion, on the other hand, has an overall negative charge because it has an additional electron added to it. So if you looked at its nucleus, you would find 7 protons, 7 neutrons, and then flying around it, if it were non-ionic, it would be 7 electrons. But if you, I'm going to put a little negative sign. Oh, it won't capture it. There we are. That's the negative that's associated with that. Okay, let's try that again. So 7 electrons, those are the negative charges. But if you add 1 more electron, then notice that the 7 pluses, the 7 minuses, they cancel each other out, but now we have this additional electron, and it brings on a negative charge. So chloride ion has an overall negative charge, and then atoms may not ionize much at all. So for instance, the carbon atom, it is composed of 6 protons, 6 electrons, 6 plus or minus neutrons, and 6 electrons. So it has an overall neutral charge in order, as part of its construction. All right, so atoms are there at the bottom of our levels of organizations, the very smallest subunits that we're really considering. But you can combine atoms together to make molecules. For instance, the water molecule is an oxygen atom. So there's the atom of oxygen, and I put a little O in it to make it oxygen. And attached to it, like little Mickey Mouse ears, are 2 hydrogen atoms. So H2, because there's 2 hydrogen atoms, and a single O make water. Glucose is a carbohydrate that is composed of 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. So glucose is C6H12O6. That would be a good one for you to kind of poke in your head. I'm not going to test you over that, but just as a frame of reference, always knowing what glucose is, C6H12O6, is kind of useful. So if we strung a whole bunch of glucose molecules together, then we would have what is referred to as a macromolecule. It's composed of repeated subunits of similar shaped molecules. And that carbohydrate that we make when we string together all these glucoses, depending on how they're oriented, it could either be cellulose, which is a starch a carbohydrate found in plant material, non-digestible to humans, and to most animals. Would I say all animals? Maybe even to all animals. We don't produce an enzyme that can digest cellulose. Or if they're oriented slightly differently, then we get the storage starch used by animals to store up carbohydrates, glucose, in the liver, called glycogen. So macromolecules come in 4 different flavors. They could be proteins, which is built of repeated subunits called amino acids. They could be nucleic acids, like DNA, that are built of repeated subunits called nucleotides. So DNA and RNA are built of nucleotides. Carbohydrates, and we can have very simple carbohydrates like the simple sugar glucose, or very complex ones like glycogen. And then finally, the 4th class of macromolecules are the lipids. Lipids, hopefully you've heard these before, but not everybody has heard of lipids. So if you haven't, don't beat yourself up about that one. But these are the fats and the oils, and also things like cholesterol. Cholesterol is a lipid as well. So macromolecules are used to assemble. Used to assemble organelles. And so I'm going to throw out some terms here, but you don't really have to know these until we get to Chapter 3 and start talking about the cell and cell biology. So mitochondria, these are the energy-producing components that are found inside of a cell that take glucose and run it through a series of chemical reactions with oxygen and other materials to break apart the glucose and to harvest the energy from it and put it into another molecule that can be used in the cell as an energy source. So that's mitochondria. The Golgi apparatus. How cool to have a cell, an organelle in a cell carrying your own name. Someday there might be a bowling apparatus, but I really doubt that. And the nucleus. You've probably heard of the nucleus before. If you haven't heard of Golgi apparatus, no big deal. Not many people have. But we'll be discussing their function in the cell. And there's a lot more organelles than that, but again, Chapter 3, that's where we're going to get that stuff. So let those rest for the moment. So organelles are found within cells. They're the machinery that run all the processes of the cell. And there are many types of cells in the body, muscle cells and neurons found in the brain or in the peripheral nervous system. Epithelial cells, these are cells that cover the external surface of the body and that line the internal hollow organs and even cover many of the organs that are found in the body. Adipose cells, clever term. It sounds all nice and good, but those are the fat cells that we're all concerned about and want to make smaller or go away altogether. So these cells may be arranged as tissues. Tissues are clusters or clumps or sheets of similar cells that are all doing the same function. For instance, simple squamous epithelium, that's one kind of tissue. We might see a simple squamous epithelium covering the surface of the heart, for instance. Cardiac muscle is another type of tissue. Dense regular connective tissue is a third type, and there's a bunch. Like I said, like we'll see them in Chapter 4, and you're gonna become familiar enough, hopefully, that you'll be able to identify all 20 of the different tissue types that we're going to be looking at in lab. Tissues cluster together and form organs. So if you have two or more tissues, then we can talk about it as an organ. So the skin is an organ, the femur, that's the bone in the upper leg, the thigh bone is an organ. The kidney is an organ, the heart is an organ, you know all the organs. Organ systems are clusters of organs that are working together to fulfill a function in the body. And then finally the organism, that's the whole body composed of all these organ systems that are all working together to maintain life. Okay, so here are those 2 pages that I told you or showed you earlier. I'll let you go through them at your own speed. You can pause the video here to copy notes if you wish, as well as this one. I'll let you pause the video here as well, and we'll pick back up again with talking about the characteristics of life. So how do we know when something is alive? What are some characteristics that we associate with living organisms? Well, there's a nice handful of things that we can associate with living organisms, and they include movement, which is caused by the muscular system cells contracting, becoming shorter, and pulling on skeletal elements of the body, or sometimes on other muscles or other fixed locations in the body. So movement, very important characteristic of life. Circulation. This is now the movement internally of fluids, or primarily fluids, to move materials from one part of the body to another. And so we think about the heart and the blood vessels there of the cardiovascular system, or the lymph flowing through the lymphatic vessels in the lymphatic system. Responsiveness. Also, sometimes you might see things that describe responsiveness using the term irritability or excitability. This responsiveness is the ability to sense and monitor stimuli from the external environment, or frequently, often from the internal environment, and then react appropriately to those stimuli. And we see a lot of nervous system function classified here under responsiveness, and endocrine system as well. So I think nervous system, pretty straightforward. If somebody threw a ball at your face, you would probably duck. You would close your eyes quickly. You know, there's a lot of things that would very rapidly occur. But how about the endocrine system? So a great example is what happens after we have a meal. We eat a big old meal. Let's see, chocolate frosted sugar bombs, perhaps, my favorite breakfast cereal. And in response to that, we see blood sugar going up. Oh, when blood sugar goes up following a meal, the body notices it, and it responds by secreting. The pancreas secretes insulin. Hopefully you knew exactly what I was going to say there. The pancreas secretes insulin, and very rapidly cells around the body get the message that, oh, it's time for us to start collecting glucose from the environment, from the blood, and tucking it away inside our cells. So responsiveness, ingestion, digestion, and absorption of nutrients. These are all characteristics associated with living organisms. And These are all responsibilities associated with the digestive system for ingestion and breaking down the food. And then also the digestive system does absorption, and then we rely on the cardiovascular systems and lymphatic system to distribute those materials. So we absorb them into the blood or into the lymph, depending on what they are, and then we can distribute those materials throughout the body. Respiration is another very important function. Many organisms, including humans, use oxygen and glucose as a means of creating a material called ATP. ATP, and we'll talk more about this again in Chapter 3, but ATP is is a very energy-rich molecule that can then be used to power all of the work of the cell. And so this process that we call respiration is all about delivering oxygen to the cells and then using that oxygen to burn glucose and harvesting the energy from that burning glucose or that oxidizing glucose. So respiration, often, in the lay world, we might use the terms respiration and breathing interchangeably, not so much in the physiology world. So we've got to be careful to separate those two. What we term breathing would be, we'd use the term ventilation to describe what we're doing with our lungs. Assimilation, this is all about converting a material that's brought into the body into a component within the body itself. So for instance, you might eat a bunch of beans, and we would digest out the protein in the beans into individual amino acids, and then cells in our body will grab up those amino acids and use them to build human proteins in human cells or even external to human cells. So when we assimilate something, we take it, we change its form, and make it part of our own bodies. Excretion, this is all about the removal of waste materials or excess materials from the body, and the urinary system, of course, is involved in excretion as we pee away hydrogen ions we don't want, nitrogenous wastes like urea and uric acid, but also pooping is a form of excretion. So the digestive system, as we pass fecal material, the undigested food products, out of the body, we're doing excretion. And as we breathe away carbon dioxide that we have ingested, we're also doing excretion there too. And then finally, reproduction, probably the most exciting of the topics that we have to talk about. And we're going to wait till the very end of next semester to get to reproduction, which is the formation of new cells. Oh, actually, we'll talk about that in our next chapter. But the production of entire offspring, that will be saved for the very end of this 2-course series. Okay, so those are the characteristics of life. So what do we need to get from our environment in order to maintain these acts of being alive? High on the list is water. So the human body is anywhere between 60 to 80% water. And now this may be a little counterintuitive, but 60%, those are the women. Women tend to have less water on a percentage basis in their body than men do. This 80%, these are the men. And this is all about relative amounts of body fat. And so women in general, thanks to the hormone estrogen, have a tendency to put on more body fat than men do. And as a result of these many cells that have lots and lots of lipid in them, we see that men have a higher, women have a lower water ratio in their body, men have a higher body ratio. So why is water important? Well, I probably have these out of order because I think the most important characteristic of water is that the chemical reactions that are occurring in the body, they all have to take place with chemicals that are dissolved in a watery solution. So this is if that watery solution becomes too concentrated, so if we sweat away or pee away too much water, and the watery environments in the body become too concentrated, then it's possible that chemical reactions will stop happening properly, and as a result of that, then we're going to see disease, illness, and eventually death if it's not rectified. It's also the fluid that is sort of the base material for all body secretions, including sweat, saliva, gastric juices, and so on. And it is the body fluid that's used to remove waste materials from the body. And so if we're low on water, it becomes more difficult to remove all of the waste materials that we have produced inside the body. So water, very important. Anywhere between 2/3 to more than 3/4 of the body weight is water. Food, also very important because it provides both energy. So we use carbohydrates and fats as energy sources. And it also provides the nutrients that are required to build new cells and new tissues and new organs, or to maintain the organs that we've already developed. So nutrients would include things like proteins and lipids, especially, that we use to build new living material in the body and to maintain those living materials that we already have. Oxygen, also very important. Without oxygen, we would not be able to release the energy from glucose to create the ATP that will then fuel the body processes that we're trying to accomplish. And oxygen is somewhere around 1/5 of the volume of the air that we breathe. So only 1 in 5 parts of air that we breathe is oxygen. Most of it, interestingly enough, is nitrogen gas. All right, and then two last environmental characteristics that are very important to maintaining life. Heat is very important. But why? Well, heat is a form of energy, and it's released by many of the metabolic reactions of the body. So, just the chemical reactions that maintain life. So, for instance, when we go out to exercise, and maybe we go and do a very brisk walk or a light run, and we become hot and sweaty, it's because the breaking down of glucose to make ATP releases heat inside the body, and then also the use of ATP to drive muscle contractions results in the release of waste, or some heat that is some energy, heat energy that is released and not used to cause muscles to contract, but just released to the environment. And so all of that released heat causes an increase in body temperature. So that heat then is, when we're just still, it's still very important to have some heat production in the body, because without warming the body, then metabolic reactions can't go fast enough. And so by adding, keeping the body warm, maintaining a relatively constant body temperature around 37 degrees Celsius, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, then our chemical reactions, chemical reactions we associate with life and living, those chemical reactions can go at an appropriate rate. If the body becomes too cold, if we don't have enough heat, then the rate of chemical reaction slows, and if we become cold enough, if we lose sufficient heat, then we may actually not produce energy rapidly enough to continue, fueling the body, and so the body dies. And just a little interesting tidbit here. I just read a summary of a scientific article that indicated that this 98.6 body temperature number is actually incorrect. That number was determined sometime in the late 1800s when, with the use of measuring devices that are not as accurate as what we have now. And if I remember correctly, the actual average body temperature of humans is somewhere around 98.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, we're not going to worry about that. It's not. This is not a thing I'm going to test you over. I want you to stick with the book and think of body temperature averaging around 98.6. But just know that the new data indicates that we're actually cooler than that. And then finally, the last important environmental characteristic that is required for life would be pressure. And pressure is a force that moves materials from one location to another. And there are two important types of pressure that are found that play a significant role in maintaining life. And one of them is atmospheric pressure. And we'll talk more about this when we get to respiration and ventilation in the second semester of this course. But the trick of getting air to go into the lungs, we don't pump it in, but instead we have a way of making a moderately low pressure environment inside the passageways of the lungs. And when that low pressure environment is formed there inside the lungs, then the higher external air pressure is sufficient to force air down into the lungs. And then the second kind of pressure that's very important is referred to as hydrostatic pressure. This is water pressure, and that's what moves, as the heart pumps and beats, it drives blood from one location to another based on hydrostatic pressure. And the same thing is occurring in the lymphatic system as we see lymph flowing from one part of the body to another. So there we go. The first portion of chapter 1 down. You just have a couple more to go. And just to review, we started by talking about the terms anatomy and physiology, what they mean, what we're looking at when we think about those two subdisciplines. Then we moved on to talking about the characteristics of life and the requirements in order to sustain life, the requirements needed from the external environment. So there we are. Oh, and there in the middle, we discussed the levels of complexity, kind of broke down those levels so that we could make sense of them and understand how each level of complexity is built on the levels that are found below it. So there you go. Remember, if you have any questions about what we've talked about here, you are always welcome to send me an email, chuckbowling@mcdowelltech.edu, or to give me a phone call, and I will respond as quickly as possible. If we're looking at the weekend here, though, you definitely want to make it by email. So from between Friday and Sunday, the best way to get a rapid answer is to send me an email. All right, have a great one. Bye.